We're so glad that you've joined us this evening. I'm Erin Coe. I'm the Executive Director of the Rockwell Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight for what promises to be a thoughtful and engaging conversation with artist and cultural leader Hayden Haynes. Tonight's program takes place during an exciting moment in the museum's history. This year, the Rockwell celebrates its 50th anniversary. Yay! A milestone that we are marking throughout a year-long initiative that we're calling Rockwell Reframed. Throughout the year, we're reflecting on the institution's evolution over 5 decades, while also looking ahead, reframing how we tell stories about the breadth and scope of the American experience through visual art, and specifically through the voices of artists working today. And this reframing methodology is made, I think, emphatically clear in the current exhibition, Native Now, Contemporary Indigenous Art at the Rockwell Museum. As part of this anniversary year, we are presenting a series of public programs and lectures that bring artists and cultural leaders into conversation with our community. Tonight's program is also connected to the nationwide Making History, Making Change lecture series organized by the Smithsonian affiliations. We are one of only 25 museums in the country that is part of the Making History, Making Change lecture series, which supports museums like the Rockwell in fostering dialogue about history, culture, and community, especially during this year, which also marks America 250. We are deeply grateful for the generous support of this lecture and the entire lecture series, which has been given so generously in memory of Nate and Wilhelmina Wolin. Their belief in the power of arts and education helps make programs like this possible, and I just want to take a moment to recognize their support this evening. It is especially meaningful to welcome Hayden Haynes to the Rockwell tonight because our relationship with Hayden is not new. It is the result of several years of collaboration and partnership. Since 2020, Hayden has worked with the museum across a wide range of programs that connected artists, students, teachers, and community members. So Hayden, I think our first collaboration took place during the pandemic. Do you remember the pandemic? No, did we block that out? I hope not. Through culture, community, and the classroom, a program developed with Local Learning, the National Network for Folk Arts in Education, and the Arts Council of the Southern Finger Lakes. Since then, our partnership has continued to grow. Hayden inspired students through our Your Place, Your Voice program, collaborated on community workshops, and helped create art-on-the-go carving kits that reached families across our region during the pandemic. He has participated in teacher professional development workshops, joined conversations on cultural stewardship, and most recently collaborated with us on the Museum Association of New York's presentation exploring how museums can more meaningfully present community stories. In 2024, the museum acquired Hayden's work, Pretendians, for the permanent collection, and it's on the cover of our Native Voices Now booklet, which I hope you all pick up and take a look at. This carved sculptural necklace or adornment is currently featured in the exhibition Native Now, where it wryly contributes to a broader conversation about themes of deception, representation, and authenticity within contemporary Native culture. For those who may not know Hayden's story, he is a member of the Seneca Nation deer clan, and he grew up on the Seneca-Cattaraugus Territory in western New York. A self-taught artist, Hayden works across a range of media, including antler carving, found objects, mixed media, and digital photography. His work draws deeply on the land, history, and cultural knowledge of his community, and speaks to themes of identity, resilience, and Native experience through what he refers to as, quote, a self-perspective framed Native lens, a distinct point of view that he will be sharing with us tonight. Beyond his artistic practice, Hayden Haynes also serves his community as the director of the Hodínöhšö Cultural Center in Salamanca, New York, which houses the Seneca-Iroquois National Museum and Archives. In this role, he's deeply committed to cultural revitalization, education, and building and strengthening community, ensuring that Seneca voices, stories, and traditions continue to shape us today and in the future. Hayden's work has been supported through acquisitions, exhibitions, and grants by various institutions, including Cornell University, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Brooklyn Museum, New York Historical Society Museum and Library, New York Folklore Society, the Center for Craft, and the New York State Council on the Arts, among others. Tonight's lecture, Exploring Native Perspectives Through Creative Practice, will offer a closer look at Hayden's artistic journey with a particular focus on his antler carving practice, which is grounded in community traditions, storytelling, and cultural knowledge. He's going to share the origins and evolution of his craft while reflecting on broader questions of how we define and interpret Native art today. Following the lecture, we'll have about 10 minutes for your questions, so think about those during the lecture. And before we begin, I kindly ask that you please take a moment to silence your cell phones so we can focus on the program tonight. It is truly a privilege to welcome an artist whom I have grown over the past 26 months to deeply admire and respect, and whose leadership, work, and his spirit of generosity have greatly enriched both the Rockwell Museum and our broader community here on the ancestral homelands of the Seneca Nation in what is today known as Corning, New York. So please join me in a warm welcome for Hayden Haynes. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Y'all Scano Goguego, Nigua Note de Nigaso. My name is Hayden Haynes, member of the Seneca Nation, Deer Clan, and I currently reside on the Cattaraugus Territory, which is where I grew up. As Aaron mentioned, I work at the Hodínöhšö Cultural Center, which is in the Seneca-Allegheny Territory. If you haven't been there, I encourage you to come and visit us at the center. Some of you might be more familiar with the name Seneca-Iroquois National Museum, but it's now housed in the center, which was built in 2018. So come to the center and see all the things that we have on display there as well. It's been a real, thank you, Erin, for the introduction. It's been a real privilege and honor to get to know Erin. As she said, I've done some various work with the Rockwell throughout the years, and it's been really great to get to know Erin and really listen and really feel her passion and her vision and her leadership here at the Rockwell. And I think that the Rockwell is really fortunate to have her here. You have to excuse me, I'm sick today, but I'm here, and I hope that my voice doesn't sound too rough today, so I apologize. What I've been asked to share is specifically about my antler carving And also, in the end, you'll see some of my photography. I've been asked to share some of those images as well. I'm going to start off by really speaking about the oral traditions, the historical context, and the archaeological context of antler carving. And those three components there comprise a belief that was created by a gentleman by the name of John Mohawk. And if you're not familiar with John Mohawk, I suggest looking him up. I know he's got YouTube videos and he's written books. He was a Seneca from Cattaraugus, and he was a philosopher. He's a trained philosopher. And he helped found he did found the White Corn Project, which is now still being carried on by the Ganondagan State Historic Site in Victor, New York. I think a lot of people are familiar with Ganondagan and the work that they're doing up there, which is really great too. So he called it the three ways of knowing. And once again, it's by fully encapsulating our thinking and our understanding of our material culture and other aspects of our culture by looking at our oral tradition, which certainly has value because there's context there that inform us on the other two components, which, as I already mentioned, the historical record and the archaeological record. And that's sort of what we'll be talking about first before we dive into some of my artwork. And I've did sprinkle in some of my images of my carvings on some of these slides on this historical, archaeological, and oral tradition context as well, okay? So just to help us understand where we're going here. So I think many people are familiar, have heard maybe a version of this creation story, the Hodínöhšö creation story. And if you haven't, I'm sure maybe you've heard the name Sky Woman, perhaps. And so, you know, there's many versions of this story. So when you go somewhere and you hear a version, you might go somewhere else to another community, you might hear a variation of that version. And that's because different, stories adapt and they change over time, and different communities tell them differently, and that's okay. There was a gentleman by the name of Seth Newhouse, and he was a contemporary of a gentleman named John Gibson. John Gibson was a Seneca from Six Nations, and he also recorded a version of the creation story, and that's the one that I subscribe to. That's the one that we tell at the Cultural Center. It doesn't mean it's the right one, but he was contemporaries with Seth Newhouse, John Buck, and John Buck was an Onondaga firekeeper as well. And so he had these Onondaga influences, but he also had his, traditional Seneca beliefs as well. So before we get to this point of Sky Woman, where she comes down from the sky world, there's this whole series of events that take place up in the sky world. And in the story, the first object that's ever mentioned in that story is an antler or a bone comb. And so what happens is there's these brothers and this brother and their sister, and they're in their longhouse, and they were separated. And then their parents would leave, the people would leave, and then they were told to, sort of like stay separate. But they wouldn't. What would happen is that she would be going and she would be combing her brother's hair. And so what that did is it enacted her over time to become pregnant. And so why that's important is because it speaks to what we'll later be finding is that this reference to this power of this material, the power of these combs, these antler combs in particular. So she becomes pregnant, and basically what happens is, well, before I get any further, we have to stop, and what you'll notice on a lot of these combs is that there's usually like these mirrored images, or there's an image and there's these, similar sides. This is based on this concept of duality, excuse me. And duality is really an instance, or it's an opposition or contrast between two concepts or aspects of something. And you'll see that throughout our creation story. You'll see that through our material culture. And so I wanted to sort of mention that here. And so what happens is there's different powers that are associated with different things that our people do and believe in our culture. So when she combs her brother's hair, becomes pregnant, that would be an example of what's called akgan, which is like, I guess you could say, a negative power that is enacted from what she was not supposed to be doing. And there's a thing called orenda. If you ever heard of orenda, that's sort of like this good this good power, okay? So Atgan and Arenda, these are also concepts of duality as well. Well, eventually what happens is, as a result of her becoming pregnant, after combing her brother's hair, he became ill and he died. And he was the first person to ever pass away in the sky world, as it's told in our story. His sister gave birth to a woman who would later become Sky Woman. And so this also sets the stage for some of our burial contexts in terms of, and that's what you'll see on this example here. This is a historic example from the Seneca site, which is called Powerhouse, and you can see there that that's a site that existed in 1640 to 1655, and it shows this deceased person, presumably is what this is depicting here. Later on, we'll keep going under the story, skipping ahead to when Sky One comes down to the earth from the sky world. And she's pregnant, as I mentioned. She ends up giving birth to twins, Skyholder and Flint, as it's told in our story. So these are two people, these are supernatural beings, right? These are not human beings like you and I. These are supernatural beings. And so Skyholder is typically associated with somebody who eventually begins to populate the earth using his supernatural powers with, I guess, things that you would call good, you know. And then his brother Flint is sort of what you would call, I guess, the bad person, the bad brother. And he's going around and he's sort of meddling in his brother's creations, creating things that are bad. So example could be, you know, a flower, and then his brother's like adding thorns to the flowers or something like that. So they're now having this conflict about what they're trying to do, and his brother Flint also really wants, like, I guess, control of the world, if you want to say it that way. So this struggle sort of enacts between these brothers. This is it's a rattle that I made out of antler, and it's sort of based on a version of the creation story. There's some strawberries in the handle there. The turtle on the top signifies Turtle Island. And I don't know if everybody can read the text on there, but if not, I'll read it right here. This is an excerpt from the story. It says, Skyholder held up a handful of earth and said, "The earth is living, the things I created are living, and when they die, they will again become earth." Flint, satisfied with the answer, began to leave, and then Skyholder asked him, "What kind of thing would kill you?" And Flint replied, "Just two things. I fear the stone of flint and the antler of a deer." So again, this is another reference to the fact that this material has some sort of significance to our people, again, okay? Because Skyholder later eventually creates two human beings from the earth, and they're called young tree and inseparable flowers. It's a male and a female, and these are the first two human beings that he ever created. So young tree, as I mentioned, is the male. And in another excerpt from the creation story, I'll read it for those that can't see it. It says, Skyholder said to young tree, "I have thought of how you can help me retrieve my mother's head," because at this point in the story, his mother's head has been placed upon the top of a pine tree by Flint. And he said, we must first disarm Flint of his power by gathering all the flint and antlers of these two islands and placing them up high. He will then believe that everyone is against him, and he will seat himself in silence inside his lodge. So it's a similar reference, but it's just another reference to this power, because when you're making things out of antler, it's a very dense material. It's very difficult. I think there'd be other ways to make similar objects, like with wood, that would be easier to handle and manipulate. But our ancestors particularly chose antler for these specific types of objects, if you want to call them that way. Another cultural context that I want to talk about is the formation of the 5 nations. This is a sculpture I did that is representative of Hodínöhšö, which is the head chief of the 6 nations. It's a title. And in the story, as most of you know, before they could form the 5 Nations Confederacy, they had to convince this very powerful person named Hodínöhšö to join their cause. Otherwise, he was powerful enough to continue to disrupt it. And so eventually what ends up happening in the story is that there's a ceremony that occurs in which they comb the snakes from his hair is how they describe it. And that's what is sort of depicted here in this image, is these snakes coming out of his hair. And so this process of combing hair, because, unkempt hair is associated with mourning, it's associated with distress, it's associated with, nowadays you could say depression and different things like that. And this combing of the hair, this straightening of the hair is a process, and it's an act that metaphorically and physically our people believe can change people. Right? It has that type of power. And even to this day, there's certain ceremonies that I know that women are doing in their communities where they're reactivating the use of these antler combs to treat people with things such as substance abuse and depression and things like that. And they're combing their hair and they're singing these songs, and they're using these antler combs, and they're relieving them of these burdens that they're carrying, I guess you can say. So again, this is just another example of in our oral tradition where this antler combs and where this material continues to come up. Once Hodínöhšö joins the cause and they begin to really, I guess, iron out the details of how this confederacy, as it's been, the Iroquois Confederacy, that's been sort of commonly referred to now, these titles begin taking place from different leaders. And one of the titles is actually a title held by a woman. And the title of this woman is Jegonsase. And what that means is that she has a new face. She's also known as the Mother of Nations. You guys might have heard that before. This is an event that occurred in our oral tradition over 1,000 years ago, around 900 AD. That's the oral tradition that I believe in, and it's backed up by archaeological evidence as well, but I don't have enough time to explain that whole story. But her original name was Yegonawe, or Big Woman, and that's later she was given that name, Jegonsase. And she was a member of the Neutral Nation. So the Neutral Nation was once a nation that also existed, but has eventually became absorbed into the Seneca Nation. So what he did, and I'll read it for those that can't, is that he told this woman, I can't even read it actually on my slide here, but basically she was told to pick up the antlers that were laying on the ground and to place them on the heads of these chiefs, okay? So these chiefs are wearing these headdresses, or gastois as we call them, and what that does is what the antlers signify is they signify that they are a chief, that they're a leader, that they have authority, that they can speak on behalf of the people. Okay, so again, I mentioned that because it's just another reference to the antlers meaning these different things throughout our culture. And it's important that a woman was given this title as the mother of all nations, because these are the mothers, these are the women that are nominating the chiefs. And they also have the authority to remove leaders from their duties if they're not performing them well. And so that speaks to the power of women in our society, in our culture. And one of the reasons why they have that authority to do those things, and they also have the authority to enact war. So a nation can't go to war unless the women say so, basically. And the reason for that is it's the women's sons, it's the women's uncles, brothers. They're the ones that are, they're the ones that are going to war. So I think that they have the right, it only makes sense, they have the right to determine whether they're going to send their loved ones to war. That makes sense to me. See, our ancestors had this way of thinking like that, and I think it's really great and it's really brilliant. They understood both aspects, I guess you could say. Before there was a lot of materials that we have nowadays, I'm talking thousands of years ago, people across the entire world had access to only a few things, right? Stone, bone, and wood. And so some of the things that our people were using these materials for, thorns were being used for like needles and awls. These hardwood knots, these are the type of war clubs that preceded stone-headed ones. And the reason why there's not a whole lot of discussion or archaeological examples of antler carvings and antler works is because it's not a material that holds up well underground unless under favorable conditions. And so that's why you don't see a lot of those materials. And then a lot of them can't be seen nowadays because a lot of those things were buried with our loved ones, and so they can't be like seen by the public, basically. So sometimes people ask, well, how did ancestors work these materials? And so here's just an example. Typically, beaver and rodent incisors, could be porcupine incisors and different things like that, muskrat incisors, were used to work the material, to kind of sort of carve it, shape it, etc. Other processes that our ancestors used would be like the score and snap technique, where you're sort of like scoring a ridge around something, and then you sort of hit it against something hard, and then it snaps off. Of course, grinding or abrasion, you can shape something like that by rubbing it against a piece of sandstone, for example. Bone splitting and splintering, that'd be the process of maybe taking like a cylindrical piece of antler and then, hitting it with a rock, for example, and then it shatters into pieces. Those pieces become the working parts of what would become an awl or a needle, for example. Soaking the bone in water, you can soften it a little bit that way as well. There's also a proposed process that you could soak it in sort of like a vinegar solution, and then allowing it to harden in lime water afterwards. And so here's some interesting things, because the Pretendians piece that Aaron spoke about is a form, right? It's a figurine, and these examples here aren't the only examples of figurines, but these are some good ones. So these are called what has been written about in the literature as September Morn, and it's named after this painting that this French guy did, where it shows a similar person sort of like covering themselves. But in my opinion, and so we do know that these figurines are found in the graves of our people, and the interpretation by non-natives is that these were things that ward off witches, I guess you could say. And I subscribe to the idea that they were certainly used to ward off something bad, something that our people were scared of, I guess. But I believe that really what happens when you look at the archaeological record, these things really don't start showing up in the archaeological record, these specific figurines, until the arrival of missionaries in our communities. So missionaries first started coming to the Hodínöhšö communities in the early 1600s, starting with the French Recollects. And they were here for a short time, and then shortly thereafter, the French Jesuits came. And the Jesuits wrote these massive volumes of their time spent with particularly the Huron and the Mohawk. And there's, you can find these writings online, but they were doing some very nefarious tactics in order to get people to convert to their belief system. And we do know, ever since the arrival of Columbus, it's been well documented, it's been documented by Columbus and all the writings since, of this like naked Indian problem, right? Because they see our people not clothing themselves, not covering themselves, and they of course view that as something bad and something evil, and that there's something wrong with our people. And our people didn't believe that. I think body anonymity for women now, our women have always had body anonymity. They always had that ability to show themselves if they wanted to, and things like that. And there was nothing disgraceful about it. So this problem that we have with natives not covering themselves is well documented. So what happens, in my opinion, is that once these missionaries came, it's estimated by research, particularly by Jose Brandow in his book, Your Fire Shall Burn No More. What happens is, in the 1600s, 80% of the Haudenosaunee population becomes decimated. And so that's when these figurines also started showing up. So in my opinion, these are a response to those events that, yes, they were being used to ward off something bad, but this bad that they were warding off was what these missionaries were telling them. Because we know that they were telling them in their own writings that if they didn't cover themselves, that they were evil, and if they're evil, then they're bad, and if they're bad, then they're going to hell and all these types of things like that. So these are some of the tactics, the scare tactics that were used against our people. So in my opinion, these are a response to that. That's why it shows them covering themselves. And then we get to this pre-contact era. So pre-contact era, the combs, they begin to take a more sort of refined shape. Typically, they only have 3 to 5 teeth, maybe 5 or 6, maybe. And they more or less are supposed to symbolize like a hand, like how your hand might comb your hair. But they're, I guess you could say, kind of simple. And that's because the lack of, I guess, technology, meaning tools at the time, they didn't have access to. These are things that are being made out of moose antler and elk antler primarily during this time. Once Europeans arrive and we begin trading with them, we begin access to various metal objects, particularly steel knives. And this is when we start seeing a flourishing of what they call these more decorative combs. So the slide before that, I guess you could call it a decorative comb. A decorative comb means that it's got teeth on the bottom and it's got some sort of imagery or something up on top. And now we're about to see how our ancestors are able to really refine their skills as artists and really start showcasing what they do. And this really happened a lot in the 1600s. In 1620, the average amount of teeth on a comb found in Seneca sites was 15. So we went from like 5 to 15. By 1650, the combs had 15 to 20 teeth. And by 1687, combs had 20 to 25 teeth. And so as you can see here, of the Hodínöhšö, the Onondaga, the Seneca, created so many of these combs, far more than any of the other nations. And so here we get into some images of duality. On the left is an ancestor piece, and on the right is a pair of comb earrings that I made. And excuse me. In this negative space that you see on the ancestor piece, it's important. You see a lot of these negative spaces on these antler combs, and what they are, particularly that sideways hourglass shape there, that's a quite common thing that we're going to see through some of these slides. So the center figure there, that also has that hourglass shape in the center. So our ancestors paid attention to not just the physical, but the abstract space or the negative space as well. And something I want to point out on here, and I don't know if you can see it on here, but 2 horizontal lines that you see on the one piece there, that's also interpreted as supporting that concept of duality. Duality. Another example of duality could be like peace and war, for example. On the last comb, those 2 lines forming the 3 peaks, you can see there's some crisscross lines there. Those are like cross-hatching. There's some interpretations on that I sort of subscribe to. It could be a lot of different things. It could be something related to origins or snakeskin. That's a possible other metaphor. We know that snakeskin and snakes in general have a huge part in our culture in terms of their ability to transform themselves, right? Just as combs transform ourselves, so do snakes. So you see a lot of cross-hatching on combs, for example. And so our ancestors are also doing some commentary, all right? So this is what a lot of people know if you're familiar with this stuff. They call this the man on horseback comb. It was found at the Seneca site, the Dan site, as you can see here, which was from 1655 to 1670. There has been some pushback on that, in my opinion, because given the time frame that the writers suggest about when this site occurred, we do know that Wentworth Greenlaw, he was reported to have gone to Hodínöhšö Territory in 1676 to take a census of the native people's fighting strength. Like, we know that, that's documented in the historical record. So those dates don't really match, but nonetheless, this is certainly a depiction of our ancestors seeing something that they've never sort of seen before and then making a piece about it. And there's several pieces like these in the archaeological record that our ancestors made of these men on these horsebacks. And that triangular hat that you see there, that's indicative of a colonist at the time, the type of hats that they were wearing back then. So you see a lot of those pointed hats that you see too. There's not a lot of time to spend on this slide here, but what I'll say is this. As I mentioned, in the 1600s, the late 1600s is the height of these decorative combs. In the 1700s, this is when the Hodínöhšö really become forced into being involved in these conflicts that are taking place in North America, having to pick sides, sometimes picking the wrong sides. And so this disrupts a lot of these types of practices in terms of carving antlers and things like that. So now there's beginning to be a drop-off in the archaeological record of these antler combs. And it's still happening, but there's definitely a decline, okay? And that's because what happens is this is coming up too, the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, if you're familiar with that campaign, right? That's where that's the end of what we see in terms of the antler carving combs for a long time, and we'll talk about how long in a minute. So that's a significant point in our history. That's the end of these combs as we see it, at least in terms of the archaeological record, however far that gets us. But what happens is, after the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, now we're talking the late 1790s, early 1800s, our ancestors then began to work with these seed beads. It's particularly started with the Seneca ancestors, particularly the Seneca ancestors in Allegheny. They're the ones that really began working with these micro beads, super tiny beads, and they began making these beaded purses, and there's an example you can see right there. So again, purse is an example of this continuation of that idea of these mirrored animals, these mirrored humans, these mirrored figures facing each other, or sometimes they're not facing each other. And so I just think that that's a cool piece to sort of show that continuation. And these beaded bags are quite remarkable, and the story behind them is quite intense as too. So there's always more disruptions. There's boarding schools that begin happening in the 1800s into the 1900s, and that also, prohibits a lot of things from coming back, I guess you can say. The rise of museums in the late 19th century, in some ways they did do well. They helped preserve some of the work, so that we can have things to look at nowadays. So in some ways that's good. It does aid in the initial interpretation, but it also displaces important material and knowledge from their communities when you take those pieces from them, or they're extracted from them. It definitely leads to harmful narratives when our voices aren't allowed to be involved into the interpretation of these materials. We are placed in these boxes, and our ancestors are literally placed in boxes. There's literally bones of our ancestors still sitting in boxes today. And this is also like, this whole rise of the museums coincides with that vanishing race thing that's taking place in the late 1800s, where people like Edward Curtis are capturing these iconic images of Native Americans throughout the North America, and people are making sculptures like James Earl Frazier's End of the Trail sculpture that's pretty famous. And these are all like things that people are doing because they're thinking that, we have to capture the imagery of these people because these people are going to be dead and gone in 100 years. That's the belief. And for some people, probably the hope in the late 1800s that that's what's going to happen. And so that's why Edward Curtis and those people were going around doing those types of things. So Arthur C. Parker, he started this thing through the Works Progress Administration, where in the early 1900s, where what he was doing was he was getting people primarily from Tonawanda and Cattaraugus and Allegheny, and he was hiring them, through federal monies to recreate, ancestor pieces, for example, and try to, revitalize some of these practices. A lot of there's some antler pieces that have been recreated, antler combs, I should say, and there's a lot of those examples are at the Rochester Museum and Science Center in Rochester, and I've seen those, and they're pretty cool. So there was an effort put there, I guess you can say, to try to bring this back. So just to bring us, full circle, Sullivan-Clinton campaign, 1779, there's an abrupt end to it. So now we're talking 1935, 1941, there's this effort here to try to bring it back a little bit, but it doesn't actually take hold, okay? This image on the left here, is an image by Stan Hill Sr. In the 1970s, he's an antler carver, he's a Hodínöhšö antler carver. He began making a lot of these sculptures like the one you see here, working in antler. And I guess he's one of the people that really started this inspiration back into working with antler. I mean, obviously this is not like a comb or something like that, but it's still something visually unique and inspiring, right? The image on the right is a photo of a carving of my personal favorite antler carving artist. His name is Norman Jimerson. He's from Cattaraugus. He's passed away now. And I have no more examples of his work right here. Here's another Norman Jimerson piece here. So we're talking 1970s, so people are getting back into it, I guess you can say. Other people getting into it at this time is Richard Nephew from Cattaraugus, and in the 1990s, John Redeye from Allegheny. He was and he still is practicing antler carver as well. Here's another Norman Jimerson piece here. And so here's a piece that I made. So I got started in antler carving when I visited the Seneca-Cattaraugus National Museum in my early 20s, when it was at its old location in Salamanca. And I'd seen works by Stan Hill Sr. That's how I became inspired by Norman Jimerson, Wayne Skye from Six Nations, John Redeye from Allegheny. Those are the ones that inspired me to start. And what I found out early on is that because of the stuff that we're talking about, because there isn't a long history, a consistent history of this work being done, because the material doesn't hold up well over time, and there's not a lot of archaeological examples, and the ones that do exist, you can't see unless you get permission from your nation to go see, because they're found in graves, because our people always buried our people with their best things, you know what I mean? It's not like nowadays where you can't be buried with a car, but for example, like your Rolex, for example, like you have a Rolex, which I don't, but if I did, but you know what I mean? We buried our people with the best things that we had. We didn't care, they didn't have a value like that to us. We gave our best to our people. We're still that way. We still give each other the best things that we have. And so it's not like today where you bury them with like some nice clothes and then all their belongings, like we get to have all that stuff. You know what I mean? That's not the way our people thought or think. So, but what I found out is that people weren't familiar with it, right? So it was hard to gain traction in terms of getting people to understand what I was doing, because they're like, what is that? You know what I mean? That's not a traditional art. That's not beadwork. That's not pottery. That's not, whatever. And so at some point I got a little frustrated, actually. And so I made this piece here because I thought, you know what? They treat my antler carving work like it's it's macaroni art that you do at recreation or something, you know what I mean, when you're a kid. So I said, well, I'm going to give them a piece of macaroni art. So yeah, it was meant to be funny. And that's a piece carved out of antler and dyed with leather dye, if I remember correctly. So the image on the left is the skirt that was made and worn by Caroline Parker, who's a Tonawanda Seneca. It's the iconic skirts that's owned by the New York State Museum. It's actually on loan to the Cultural Center right now, so you can actually see this actual skirt on display at our Nosaguende Cultural Center right now. But this is the design, the celestial tree that you'll see a lot of these variations in people's artwork today, but that's the original piece that we all draw our inspiration from. And so sometimes what I'll do too is I'll make some more contemporary twists on things. And the image on the right is a take on the celestial tree, but if you can look at it, it's like a cell phone tower, and there's these Wi-Fi symbols and these little cords hanging off, and then some literal cords and earphones hanging off there. And the reason I did that was just, and I made all these antler beads and stuff like that, but the reason I made that was just, was a way to say, like, yes, we do make our traditional things, but yes, we also live in a modern world, and yes, we still, comment on the world that we live in today is basically what that one was about. And here's the Pretendians piece that is on display downstairs. I made this piece. Pete Jemison, I think a lot of people are familiar with that name, as an artist and the former site director of the Ganondagan State Historic Site. He was doing a show in New York City, and he asked me to create something for the show, but he said, I don't want you to make one of your traditional pieces. He said, I want you to make something really wild and different, I guess. And so I had an idea for a piece like this for a while, and so I thought, this might be a good time to do that. And it speaks to this problem that we have in our communities with people who are claiming Native ancestry and getting, basically opportunities that are reserved for Native people, whether that be grants, whether that be tenures in academia, whether that be roles in Hollywood, et cetera, like stuff like that. So that's sort of what this piece is about. And it's based off Pinocchio, obviously. I hope you can sort of pick that up from there. So the image on the left is an image of a piece of bone fragment that was found at the Ganondagan State Historic Site, which is a Seneca site that ended in 1687 after the French destroyed it. Excuse me. And I took a take on that, changed it to, and I made this antler necklace, this comb necklace, I should say, and I had him holding a sign that says, "Reclaim what's ours." And it's reclaiming the design, it's reclaiming, everything, really. Our voices, our narrative. It's like a message, and I called it a message from our ancestors. That's the name of the piece. And there's the full piece right there. This is a recent piece that I did in collaboration with my wife, Randy Spruce, who's here, who's the co-curator of the Native Voices Now exhibit. She's also an artist, and we collaborated on this piece. This is a piece about the creation story. So on the bottom there is a loon, which is said to be the first thing that sort of calls out to signify, to let everybody know that there's something coming, I guess you could say it like that. And then Sky Woman is coming down, as you can see, from this hole in the sky world, grasping these berries, grasping these other things. And then there's these herons that are coming to catch her, because in the version that I subscribe to, it's herons that are coming, as opposed to other versions you might hear, which are not wrong, or they might be Canadian geese, for example, and things like that. So we made it like a real Seneca-specific piece here. So I carved a lot of these pieces, like the strawberries, the herons, and the medallion itself, and Randy painted them so beautifully and really brought it to life, and she assembled the piece together, and it came out really well. And so I would get into some of my photography. So what happened was, I realized that, I wanted to tell more of my stories with my pieces, and it was hard to do so by doing so with just like an image of my piece, on a black background, for example. So I had an idea that I might have some people, local community members, wear some of my pieces whenever it felt appropriate, and, I guess model them, and to kind of bring it to life more. And so there was this project. This was right during the Kamloops time. Do you guys remember hearing about the Kamloops thing? This was in Canada when they were finding the graves of the children from the residential boarding schools that were up there that sparked this whole big thing a few years ago. This is right around that time. But what people don't realize is that there was a Native American residential boarding school that operated in Cattaraugus, right on our territory. And there was another one operated by the Quakers in Allegheny called Hodínöhšö. And so we had these things right here. You know, I mean, we didn't have to go to Carlisle necessarily or wherever those like other places. So the building on the left here is the old infirmary of the Thomas Indian School. There's only a few remaining buildings left, and that's one of them. And so I just captured this image of, her name's Jocelyn Jones, like looking into this window, and then I obviously adjusted the colors, like the person in the window, which is actually obviously her reflection, sort of looking back at her through that. And then the picture on the right is her sort of just picking this orange tiger lily, at the United Mission Cemetery, which is also on the Cattaraugus Territory, which is also where the founders of the Thomas Asylum for Orphan and Destitute Children, Asher and Laura Wright, that's where they're buried, right on our territory too. And so that United Mission Cemetery, there's also children from Thomas Indian School that are buried there as well as other people that are not associated with the Thomas Indian School. So we did just this like photo shoot, and then again, it was just to help tell a story, I guess is one way to put it. This is another example of storytelling, I guess. There's a story of the cornhusk doll. There's many stories. There's one story where, the reason is to tell the story is why our cornhusk dolls don't have faces. If you ever heard that story or seen our cornhusk dolls, they don't have face, and why is that? It has to do with vanity, to make a long story short. And basically there's this woman who, is sort of obsessed with herself because she's physically beautiful, and then she's always going down to the water to admire herself, and she's not taking care of her duties in her community like she's supposed to. So the creator gives her a couple warnings that she needs to get back to her duties and not be sort of obsessed with herself, or he's going to punish her. And she didn't listen, and so eventually next time she went down to the water to look at herself, she had no face. And so that's sort of like what's sort of being depicted here, I guess. This is a story of, this is a series that I did in Cattaraugus with another, so the other image was also Jocelyn Jones. This is Morgan Huff from Cattaraugus, and this is a story about, or this is a series about the spirit of the corn. So we have this, idea in our culture that there's a spirit that sort of looks after our corn and takes care of it, for example, and the corn is alive, it has a spirit itself, obviously. So I just wanted to do some abstract stuff with that idea of what the spirit of the corn, I don't say could look like, but just sort of speak to that, I guess, is what I'm saying. So there's a few images, and here's another image here. And these are some photographs that this is the most recent ongoing project here, and this is what I'm like most excited about. This is my favorite photography thing I've done to date, because what this is, these are portraits, and there's a whole series of each of these women, and these women are the clan mothers. They're the name givers for each of the 8 Seneca clans in Allegheny. So what they do is one of the things that they do, I should say, is give names to the babies in the longhouse, or the longhouse, you could call it like the ceremonial center. It is the ceremonial center. You call a longhouse like a religious center, something like that. This is where important duties take place. And these women are tasked with keeping names. These are Seneca names that are passed down through generations and generations and generations. They're reused. So when I pass away, my name goes back into onto the list. And somebody else will have my name, my Deer Clan name. The image on the left, the photo on the left, that's Alexia John. She's the clan mother of the Deer Clan. Image on the right is Sue Sequoia. She's the clan mother of the Heron Clan. And so what the project is I'm creating these specific necklaces for each clan, and then the clan mothers are wearing them. and I'm photographing them. But it's not about the necklace. There's social media posts, and there's a blog written about this. This is funded by supported by the Walker Youngbird Foundation. And it's really a way to give these women voices. So what happens is they get interviewed, I interview them, and they tell whatever they want to tell me, all right? And it was very difficult to get all 8 of these women to agree to sit for their portraits and tell a little bit about them, because in our culture, especially in the roles that they have, we're not really supposed to be, like, I guess, out there like that. You know, they're handling their duties, they're doing what they're supposed to do, and they don't really need unnecessary attention. So it's very difficult, and I'm happy they all eventually agreed. And then eventually these necklaces will be given to them and they can have them. But this is a way to bring their voices out. This is Rhonda George, the Snipe clan mother. And what she's doing right now is she's mentoring her daughter, Raylan George. So this was a moment where I was photographing both of them. And they were taking turns. They were going to take turns wearing the necklace at some point. And so this is Rhonda putting the necklace, the Snipe clan necklace, onto her sister. I'm sorry, her daughter, Raylan. And here's an image of Raylan. Excuse me. This image on the left here is a quite an important piece that what happened was I was at the Rochester Museum and Science Center, because they have the largest collection of Seneca combs, decorative combs, in one place at the Rochester Museum and Science Center, at the Rock Foundation collection, I should say. And I was there studying some stuff with a student from Cornell University. Her name's Dusty Bridges, and we were looking at the combs, and they had some pieces that were just rectangular cutouts, and they were just shaped, but there was nothing on them. So I guess you'd call them like a comb blank. And so I had a crazy idea. I thought it wouldn't hurt to ask the Rochester Museum and Science Center if they would ever let me finish one of those combs, would it? And then I did, and then surprisingly, they actually let me work on one of those pieces. And I was able to complete a piece. So that piece in particular came from the Ganondagan site. So we're talking 1687, so that's over 300 years old, or however, I'm not good at math. Very old, let's just say. So that was quite a remarkable experience to really feel and hold something that an ancestor handled and cut out. And on the top, you can see it's kind of jaggedy, and can't see from the pictures, but there's some cut lines on there and everything like that. Basically, I wanted to leave all those natural edges, not the natural edges, the edges that the ancestor worked on. I didn't want to touch that. I didn't want to shape it nicely, and I just wanted to add a touch in the middle, and that's what I did there. And so I thought it would be good to document this by bringing it back to Ganondagan, where it originated from, and to take some photos there. So I asked Charlie Ray Hill if she would model these for me, and we went to Ganondagan, and I photographed her there, close by to where there's ancestors still buried that haven't been unearthed yet, and that's where we were. Just so happens it's right next to this milkweed field, and that's where she began sort of playing with the milkweed. So that was quite a remarkable project. So I'm fortunate that the Rochester Museum of Science Center allowed me to do that. It's on display at their center right now in their new Hodínöhšö continuity exhibit. If you haven't had a chance to see it, there's some really remarkable things that have been done up there. That's all I have for you tonight. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Hayden. That was a wonderful presentation. We learned a lot about combs and comb history. I would now like to open it up to any questions from anyone in the audience. And I'm going to come to you with a microphone. So when you have your question, if you can speak it right into the microphone, this way everyone can hear.
My question is about the size of the combs. They're made from antlers. Some of the early ones you showed had like 12 tooth. I mean, how big of an antler could that be? This one looks smaller, but I can't image some of the bigger ones. How big are they?
The prehistoric ones were much larger, could be, 5 to 7, maybe even, about 5 to 7 inches. And then during the height of the comb era, those ones got very small and very intricate. Some of those are only maybe 2.5, 3 inches big to maybe 4 at the most, 4 inches. And so they're very small actually, and they're very delicate. It's really surprisingly how they've held up over time given how thin and small they are. But they were buried with the ancestors, and they were buried under favorable conditions, such as next to usually in clay pots, for example. So they were held up, preserved somewhat in that. When they're next to things such as metal things like brass, for example, because our people bury themselves with brass ornamentation too, being close to that also helped preserve the material as well. And then the one that you see in the picture here, that was a comb blank, so it probably wasn't meant to be that big in its final stage. But that was probably 4.5 or 5 inches, maybe something like that, tall.
Thank
You're welcome.
Did we have a question over here?
Well, my question was similar. I wondered if the width had to do, is the antler somehow flattened out to make that flat space, or was it that big around?
Typically, I think that's why they use the elk and the moose, particularly elk, because there's a lot. On the bigger elk, you can really, usually on a lot of them, there's naturally flat areas on there. And that's what I use today too, so.
Thank you. Any other questions? Right over here, Gigi.
Hayden, thank you. Do you think that antlers are like antenna to pick up information?
I'm not sure. I wish that I knew what our ancestors knew in terms of their understanding of it. But again, as I mentioned, when 80% of your population passes away, and everything that is, the medicines, the ceremonies, the oral traditions, the stories, the ways to work materials, that all that information goes with those people. Some of it people might be able to retain through their apprentices or whatever. But that's why a lot of that stuff nobody really knows. And I wish I knew why. I wish I knew more. You know what I mean? I wish I knew more.
Thank you. Over here.
This is absolutely wonderful. I'm assuming you're using modern technology, steel needles, saws, rasps, and those kinds of things. Have you attempted to do things using sort of the old tools?
That's a good question. Yes, I do use modern tools. No, I haven't actually done that myself. I've thought about it at times, but I just haven't really, taken an interest that much to work it like our ancestors have, for sure. You're welcome.
We might have time for one more question.
Thank you. What do you personally find most challenging with working with the material?
I would say the limitations of the material itself in terms of the shape, right? Because, well, there's the porousness of the inner sides of it too that you have to contend with. No two antlers, I would say, are always the same. So you only have two that are same size, but genetics and age might play a factor into how much porousness is in the middle versus the outside edge, which is the outside is the carvable area. But just the shapes themselves, you can't do a whole lot in terms of size and things like that with a three-dimensional piece, for example, because they don't make antlers with blocks this big, so you can't make a block like that, you know what I mean? So you have to just work with what you have, and usually it works out okay because I have ideas, and then you just kind of work with the material, as opposed to trying to force it. And then when you do that, usually it works out okay in the end, I believe.
Well, thank you, and thank you again. That was a very powerful presentation. Let's give Hayden one more round of applause.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, and I just want to share, if you want to see Hayden's Pretendian piece on view, the exhibition Native Now is on view through May 4th, so please come back and visit. Thanks again.